due respect, a lot of honor and happiness, inexplicable, I would like to introduce the first author of the day. We have two. An author, politician, a former international civil servant, Dr. Shashi Tharoor. He is a man, I'm sure, almost a major section of India adores. I'm sure, for the looks also, sir. And again, a man of words, a man who has to his credit a book which has crossed 25 years and still running strong. And last year, we had a special moment where we were celebrating the 25th anniversary of the book. And again, we have something more special coming up. Dr. Tharoor, educated in India, United States, and completed PhD in 1978 at Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy. I'm sure you would have read this over and over again at his website. And me telling that now, you would think as taking your time away from him. And there is a second author, and oh, I'm so excited because I would like to say that this is for the first time when a father-son duo are on stage releasing their books on the same day, a historical moment. Yes, I take this opportunity to introduce none other than Dr. Shashi Tharoor's dear son, Kanishk Tharoor. A big round of applause for him. He's a presenter of Museum of Lost Objects, a 10-part BBC radio series on cultural destruction in Iraq, Syria on BBC Radio 4 and BBC World Service in 2016. And his new book, being released in English and Malayalam at the same time, international release today, that also yet another historical moment. He writes the weekly Far and Near column for Hindustan Times and monthly Cosmopolis column for the Hindu Business Line. An associate editor at the online politics and cultural magazine OpenDemocracy.net, a researcher and interviewer for the Guantanamo Bay Oral History Project at Columbia University, and global soccer editor at Roads and Kingdoms. What more? I'm very sure it's none other than Kanishk Tharoor. A big round of applause. It's my pleasure and honor to welcome the two authors, dear authors, onto the stage. Let the applause continue, please. First of all, it's a different feeling, father and son on the stage. And we just had a brief moment when I was talking about the same thing, father and son, who are authors releasing the book on the same time, contemporaries, I would say. So how does it feel? And it's a unique experience. I'm sure in this world, this would be the first one.
Well, it's a fabulous experience. I'm very, very proud of my son, Kanishk. He's written a terrific book which has got magnificent reviews already in India. Is about to come out in America and Britain. But I'm pleased to say that the Malayalam edition has beaten the Americans and the Brits by emerging already today. We're seeing it for the first time. To actually be able to share the moment with him is fantastic, because it so happens that the Malayalam translation of my earlier book, India Shastra, has just come out. That's this in Malayalam, and here it is in English. And this book actually was a year ahead of Kanishk's, but it took a while to get rendered into Malayalam, and so it so happens both books are coming out on the same day here in Sharjah. As it happens, yesterday I also launched my new book in India. The Vice President of India unveiled it. It's called An Era of Darkness, the British Empire in India. And so I'm at the moment sort of on a bit of a book high, but nothing could be more exalting and thrilling than being able to share this moment with my son, Kanishk.
Let me ask Kanishk one small, interesting fact which I read about. Like, he introduced you to Twitter.
Yes, he was the first member of the family to start tweeting.
And I have to say, at this point, I use it much less than anybody else in our family. But first, let me just say that it's an honor to be here in Sharjah. This is actually my first trip to the UAE. And it's a pleasure in particular to launch the Malayalam edition of my book here, because Sharjah is so full of friends and family, and I'm so pleased that they're here with us to share this day with us. But yes, for my sins, I introduced my father to Twitter, and the rest is history.
Because once it starts, then it keeps rolling. Would like to ask one more about your book. I mean, because it's a collection of short stories, and fiction or reality. There is a thin line which divides fiction and reality these days. So how contemporary, how fictitious is it, or how real is it?
Well, I mean, a lot of this, so it's a book of short stories, about 13 different short stories, that if there's an overarching theme, I would say it's about looking at how identities shift in times of great turmoil and change. So for example, the title story of the collection, Swimmer Among the Stars, is about a woman who is the last speaker of her dying language. And so in that story, I'm looking at the character of this woman, but I'm also exploring a larger issue that we all face, that we're all facing around the world, which is the way globalization is causing the death of languages. And so there are various other stories like that that are fictitious, as you said, but are also mining contemporary political issues, or issues very much in the real world, for the material of fiction.
So should I call it a kind of reflection of the real times onto a fictional wall? Is that what your short story collection is all about?
That's a fair description of all good fiction. All good fiction, it's imaginative, it's thoughtful, it's insightful, but it has to be anchored in something real.
At the same time, Kanishk goes into different time zones in the book. I mean, he's got one story that's set in an imaginary sort of Central Asian kingdom just before the Mongol barbarians are about to invade this town, and the conversations amongst the people expecting to be invaded any day. Then there's another one which is actually set in the future, in a world completely consumed by global warming, where the oceans have risen, cities are being flooded, and the United Nations is meeting in a spaceship that's circumnavigating the globe because the Earth is no longer habitable. It's quite amazing, actually, the way in which he transcends time, space, geography, and all concerns. And that's particularly striking in an Indian author because in some ways he's very much, I think, one of the first serious writers of the post-globalization era, where all these boundaries and borders don't matter so much anymore.
Is that an author speaking or a dad speaking?
I think it's a reader speaking, to be honest. I enjoy reading his work, and when I'd read these stories individually, when they came together as a collection, I could see how vast his concerns were. And I'm really sharing my enthusiasm with the audience here, because there are a few copies here, of course, that people can get hold of, but equally because I think that, honestly, he is one of the more exciting voices now in contemporary fiction, because he's doing things that nobody else has done. And that's what I find utterly fascinating.
Let me borrow a line from
Father would have
Rich
to say
Wessing.
that.
Because I would like to borrow his line saying that he follows a full-time writing profession.
I do. Both my wife and I are writers, and we manage to pay the bills and keep food on our tables. But yes, it's the life I've always wanted. It's not the easiest life. I'm working on a novel at the moment, but I'm also doing journalism. I'm writing a column. But it's a great privilege to be able to follow my passion and to do what I've always wanted to do, which is to devote myself at all times to my writing.
Let me come to the era of darkness, the British Raj. Is it something which we would get an insight into, something which we don't know about, or is it your version of what happened during those days?
Well, I suppose all history is subjective, so it's always somebody's version. But my version is anchored very solidly in facts. The book is written as a passionate argument about the iniquities and the damage done by the British Empire in India, but it is at the same time solidly based on historical documents of the period, as well as in some of the contemporary scholarship on many of the issues here. Very simply, Britain took over what was once, at that time, one of the richest countries in the world, which accounted for 23% of global GDP, and reduced it by the time they left into one of the poorest countries in the world with less than 3% of global GDP. A country where there had been absolutely no recorded instance of landlessness or poverty, and which was reduced by 1947 into a land when 90% of the people lived below the poverty line. A country which had a thriving textile industry, shipbuilding industry, steel industry, and which they managed to thoroughly dismantle, destroy, and replace with the exported products of their industries. A country whose resources they exploited, extracted, and drained out to Britain in the course of their 200 years of rapacious rule. A country where 35 million people died, totally unnecessary deaths in famines that were preventable and which could have been dealt with, except the British deliberately chose not to do so. I can go on, and I can give you examples to substantiate every one of the claims that I've just made. But these are the reasons why I believe the British Empire in India, in the words of the American historian Will Durant, who wrote this in 1930, was, as he put it, the greatest crime in all human history. It was a terrible atrocity, and unfortunately, people don't know enough about it, least of all the British, because they don't teach the realities of their own colonial history to their school children. So the book, I thought, needed to be written.
Is it that all Indian history, what we learn, is written by the British?
No, that's not entirely true. There are Indian historians, including even nationalist historians. But somehow the self-justificatory mythologizing that the British have done about themselves has got much greater currency. And in recent years, in the last 10 or 15 years, there have been a lot of books written that have extolled the so-called virtues of empire. Writers like Neil Ferguson, who has talked about empire as laying the foundations for globalization today, and has urged the Americans to follow the model of the British imperial project, or Lawrence James, who actually claims that empire was one of the most benign and altruistic institutions in the world. All of this, these are the books that are bestsellers, particularly in the Western world, and that people are reading. And they're completely self-serving, hypocritical twaddle, backed up by romanticized television shows in Britain, like, the Far Pavilions or Indian Summers or whatever, which have tried to portray the British Empire in this rather gauzy, rose-tinted light. And I think it's high time that somebody stood up and said, this was never the reality, and it certainly wasn't the reality for any of the Indians who were the victims of the daily cruelties of the British Raj.
I lived, if I may add, I lived in the UK for 3 years and worked there. And I was so surprised the extent to which, in their own education system, the experience and workings of empire is just not taught in the UK. And so my father's book on this subject has just come out in India, and it will be coming out in the UK in the spring. And I think almost it's more important, as important for Brits to read this history as it is for Indians.
Thank you, Kanishk. In fact, when the book had just reached the bookshops in India, a Pakistani journalist, Moni Mohsin, wrote an article in The Guardian in the UK saying exactly what Kanishk has just said, that she has raised 2 children, sent them to one of the best public schools in Britain, the Westminster School in London. They have studied history, but there's not one word of colonial history they've been taught. They have no idea what the British did. And in fact, the British people generally don't really have much of a sense, other than this romanticized nonsense, of what the empire was all about. Or even, I remember there was a placard held up by a protester during a race riot in Britain a few years ago, in which this brown or black-skinned lady held up a placard saying, "We are here because you were there." That's something the British don't even realize, the connection between the extraction of colonial resources that built the British empire and the British capital. I mean, London's buildings are all financed by loot from the colonies. And on top of that, of course, they don't understand why. That's the connection that has brought so many immigrants from those countries to Britain.
I remember the talk in UK, which is viral on YouTube. I'm sure many of you would have watched it so much because that was something which was very viral and everyone was talking about it, about the amount of money which has to be given back to India for all the extortion and all that happened during the British Raj. So that darkness is one chapter. And let's talk about the India Shastra, the Malayalam version. How excited are you about the Malayalam version now?
Well, I'm excited, but my gosh, I'm a bit intimidated by the size of it. It's quite a fat book. And the reason is that it's 100 essays. Kanishk says 13 stories. Mine is 100 short essays about various aspects of contemporary India. You know, I had written 2 earlier books of non-fiction about India. My best known, I suppose, is India from Midnight to the Millennium, which was published on the occasion of the 50th anniversary of India's independence. And then 10 years later, my publishers talked me into doing a sort of sequel for the 60th anniversary, which was The Elephant, the Tiger, and the Cell Phone. India Shastra came out a little ahead of the 70th anniversary, in fact, a good couple of years ahead of it, because the publishers felt that with the Modi election of 2014, that there'd been a kind of sea change in India, and that was the right moment to capture that transformation. So when the book came out in India in January of 2015, it really was the first book-length sort of look at contemporary India at a time when the Modi government was in power. They had only been ruling for 6 months at that time, and I had a number of essays on those first 6 months in office, plus, of course, the other aspects of Indian life, culture, politics, economics, and so on. Everything from the episode of the Madras High Court judge who was thrown out of a club because mundas and veshtis are not allowed in Madras Gymkhana and the Madras Club and places like that, which reminded me of myself being thrown out of my sister's wedding reception in one of these fancy Madras clubs because I was wearing a kurta. And the dress code of the club required tucked-in shirts. So I had to retreat behind a bush and tuck my kurta into my shirt before I could attend my sister's own wedding reception. Such events, I mean, these colonial hangovers had to be got rid of. That's just one example, but there are literally 100 essays in the book, and that's why it's quite so fat. But it's available still in both English and Malayalam, and we hope that you will find a lot there to dip into. It's a kind of book that doesn't need to be read cover to cover, but rewards dipping in to different themes at different times.
There was a person who talked to me a little while ago, and he was saying how it would be. You were talking about your sister's, the ceremony which happened at the Gymkhana. He was asking, how would it be? It would be more like a literature festival at home. All authors, son, daughter-in-law, father, all authors meeting. It would be a literature festival at home. Is it like that?
Kanishk, you can answer that, I think.
My mother's also a professor of literature. So my brother and I, and my brother is a journalist. I have a twin brother, Ishan. He's a journalist for the Washington Post. So we are a family that's somewhat devoted to writing and reading. And you know, my brother and I were very lucky to grow up in a household where books were just steaming out of the cracks. We really were steeped in it from a young age. And as a result, the possibility of being a writer was always something that was made apparent to us. And that is a privilege that I'm really grateful for. Our dining table conversations aren't only just about literary issues or serious political conversations. We do have fun sometimes. But yes, we do enjoy having these kinds of exchanges, and I suppose a family dinner is a small literary festival from time to time.
My own father actually was on the wrong side of the writing profession, in the sense that he was in the newspaper business, but on the managerial side, not the editorial side, which I think in some ways was a great mismatch, because he was a wonderful writer, just of letters and of after he passed away, the letters we got from so many people, and many talked about how much they enjoyed his letters. He just was somebody with a way of words. He loved words. He used to play word games and so on. And this infected my own childhood very much. I was an asthmatic child, and so when I was holed up in bed, unable to breathe, the truth is that those were the days when there was no television in India, there were no computers obviously anywhere, there was no Nintendo. All I had was books. And so I grew up and I started, when I exhausted the books I could read, I started writing. And so started writing from the age of 6 or so. My father encouraged me, had the stories typed up. That somehow gave me the sense of faith in myself as a writer. I was first published, a short story of mine, when I was 10 years old. And there's nothing more addictive than seeing your name in print. I think it's as bad as that first piece of chocolate or the first kiss or whatever. You keep wanting to do it over and over again. and so I kept writing throughout my school and college days. But unlike Kanishk, I never risked becoming a full-time writer. Not because I didn't enjoy writing, I loved it, but because somehow middle-class India in the 1960s, my parents said, no one makes a living out of writing. You better work, do pass in your exams, do well in your studies, get a proper job and write when you can. And I think partly looking back on that upbringing, I think in many ways one of the reasons I'm particularly happy that Kanishk has had the courage to make the choice he's made is because even though my parents loved and indulged my writing, they never saw it as a viable full-time life. Whereas with this young man, I genuinely do see it as something that he will leave a mark on as the principal thing he did in his profession. We were just chatting before coming here, and I was telling you how if you read V.S. Naipaul's books and this little author bio, he always publishes this one sentence in this author bio, which says, he first published a story or whatever, he became a writer at the age of, I can't remember what it was, 23 or whatever. And then his next sentence is, he has followed no other profession. He's very proud of the fact that he dedicated himself to his craft and did nothing else to distract him from it. And I think that since Kanishk has embarked on that path, I'm also expecting similar accomplishments from him.
But we should also be clear that there are many examples of great writers who also juggled other professions. José Saramago, the Portuguese winner of the Nobel Prize, I think wrote his first book in his 40s and had another job for much of his life.
Saint-Jean Perse, who won the Nobel Prize for Literature in 1960, was the Secretary General of the French Foreign Ministry. Under his real name, Saint-Jean Perse was a nickname.
And you've juggled a career in the UN and now in Indian politics, and I think many people would still consider you quite an accomplished writer, so you shouldn't be too hard on yourself.
Is that a glimpse of dinner talk, what we're getting?
That was what the whole idea about, because when the father, son, daughter-in-law, everyone, when you have a family meet, it's more of a literature festival, because you have so much to pinpoint and to debate, and you have lots to share.
In fact, when Kanishk's brother is also with us, he's a foreign affairs writer for the Washington Post. And they're both very fond of history, some of which comes into Kanishk's fiction as well, by the way. He's got an amazing series of stories based on Alexander the Great. But not Alexander the Great, the historical figure, but Alexander as reimagined by later retellers, including in the medieval era. And Ishan writes about foreign affairs, but often digging back into the centuries. So if you go on the Washington Post website, you'll find some of the most amazing pieces where he looks at not just the contemporary politics of the Arab world, for example, but he's traced then a piece on Mosul, right? Over 500 years of Mosul's history and where it's gone and that sort of thing. So we don't only talk about literature or even about politics, we also enjoy arguing about history.
The great fortune we have as a family is that we take pleasure in each other's interests. And that actually, I think, is sometimes rare for families, that we're genuinely, passionately interested in the things that each of us are interested in.
How more rare can it get? Because we have a special moment of releasing the book on the same day. that's the rarest of the rarest. And I would say even at this particular moment when we are talking at the 35th edition of this particular book fair, which has been over and over every year, the ruler inaugurates this fair.
Right.
So 35 years, a person has been consistently looking at how to get the words to the people. So such a historical fair, such a historical moment, and such a historical moment when I'm talking to the father and son. I really wish we had Ishan also here so that he could share a moment of history, because the interest in history. And I would ask you, Kanishk, did you break the record? Because he started writing at the age of 6. So when did you start?
It was actually something around that age. I remember my brother and I did have a few distractions, unlike my father. We are children of the late 80s and 90s, so we had video games. But my father, I remember very early on, my father had this old desktop with one of those blue screen WordPerfect word processors. And my brother and I would often take turns to just spend some time writing stories. And they were quite often, we were 6, 7 years old, so I remember I was in love with the history of the Mauryan Empire. So I wrote a story about, completely impossible now that I think back on it, a naval captain in the Mauryan Empire at the age of 6. So I'm tapping along on my father's ancient word processing system. I don't know if that's breaking records, but both my brother and I have been writing from quite a young age.
There was a particular interview where someone asked Mr. Bachchan that when you go to sleep, do you go with us like fully dressed up, decked up, the Bachchan's family, do they sleep like that? And I would like to ask it in a different way. Is it that just get home and start writing?
No, we're human beings like everyone else, and I won't speak for Kanishk and let him answer for himself, but in my case, it all depends on what condition I get home in. Often it's exhausting, and very often, especially in Thiruvananthapuram, when I get home, there are people waiting with their problems and petitions and so on. So there's never really an escape from the real world. One of my challenges is that the intrusions of the real world in my writing have really played havoc with my productivity as a writer, because my last novel, for example, was written in 2001, was published in 2001, Riot. And it's now been 15 years since I've been able to publish fiction. Why? Because I have started a number of novels, and you see, when you write fiction, you need to create an alternative universe, populate it with characters, people, episodes, dialogue that are as real to you as those of the people you encounter in your daily life. And to be able to sustain that other alternative world, you need to keep returning to it day after day after day. Now, if you're in the kind of profession where you're writing something, you've conjured up this other universe, and then suddenly you're interrupted and you've got to go off for a number of days or even a number of weeks to some hotspot around the world, or you have to interrupt just as a moment of creative frenzy because in my present political life, some political neta has shown up, or political worker, or for that matter, just a constituent needing something to be done. It becomes very difficult to keep on breaking the spell and returning to it. I find that one of the reasons that I have been much more productive of non-fiction in recent years is because non-fiction is interruptible. You can read something that you've written and had to interrupt halfway through, pick up the threads of your thought and continue writing it even after a break. Whereas I find that with fiction, the illusion is shattered too easily. And so my laptops have been littered with incomplete, half-begun manuscripts of 4 or 5 different sort of novels. That's something that I find is, if you like, a negative consequence of doing a full-time job in writing. Very often I write late at night when it's fairly safe that no one's going to be coming down, but by then you're often exhausted. You may not be at your freshest or most productive. And that too can be a challenge. For my most recent book, An Era of Darkness, I did one thing that I had never done before. It had required a lot of research and assimilation of material. So I took all the stuff off to the mountains of Bhutan, thanks to the generosity of His Majesty the King of Bhutan, who invited me to use one of his personal cottages. And I took 12 days off and did nothing all day. There was no phone calls, no visitors, no meetings. Just morning to night, 18 hours a day I wrote. And in that sort of mad frenzy of writing, I was tremendously productive. And I managed to get the entire first draft, which is about half of the final finished book, out in those 12 days. And now I realize that that's such a luxury, but if one can do that, if you've done your basic preparations, have the material you want to work with, and then you can just sit and write without any other distractions, it could actually accomplish far more than if you tried to write bits and pieces every day. Now that's my answer, but Kanishk may be very different.
My father has, one of the many things that my brother and I admire of our father is his monstrous work ethic. He really did, because we were in touch while he was writing this book, and he really did pull 18-hour days where with extreme focus, he just sat and poured it out. And that is something, I think he might agree, that's something that's more difficult to do with fiction than it is to do with nonfiction. Fiction can be much fussier. I mean, again, I'm fairly young in my career of writing fiction. I'm working on my first novel right now. And it is hard to write a novel, and it is certainly hard to write a novel if you're doing other things. As my father said, you have to live in it. You have to dwell in it, and build it at the same time. And so that kind of focus and time is really something that can be difficult to carve out when your mind is elsewhere, when you have other obligations. So I'm lucky right now that I do have the luxury and the space to just focus on my fiction with certain other obligations, but I can carve this time out for myself to build this world and to hopefully complete it.
Yet
You must
again-
be writing, what, 8, 10 hours a day?
Right. That's the question which I had in my mind.
I don't want to embarrass myself, and closer to 8 hours a day, I would say.
There is also an amount of difficulty or a time frame attached to being a columnist, because you have to be contemporary, you have to be topical, you have to stick
Meet
on to what is
deadlines.
happening. Yeah, meet deadlines. So how fiction goes into it? Like, you have 8 hours, you split yourself between that?
I managed to keep my journalism completely separate from my fiction. And actually, for me, sometimes it can be a refreshing break, because I'm using it almost like I'm using a different part of my brain. For the last few months, I've been writing about the US presidential election for the Hindustan Times. So that has allowed me to enter in a completely different space from my novel, but it's not a distraction that really keeps me that much from the work of my novel.
From words to politics, like you've been writing about the US presidential elections. So what would you like to share your thoughts on? Because everyone is so excited about that one topic around the world.
Well, I'm not sure if excitement is the right word. There's, I think, a bit of trepidation, maybe a bit of
Yes,
fear.
it's the fear. What's going to happen between the devil and the deep sea?
It's somewhat of a curse being asked to forecast things, and everybody has correctly been more or less convinced that Clinton would win. But so many things and so many polls have narrowed in the last 2 weeks. And so many, the American system is a little bit Byzantine because it's so dependent on the votes in specific states. And often those states can be a bit difficult to predict in advance. There's so many undecided voters. And, so I'm still wary of the possibility of a Trump victory, as I think many people around the world are. I think it's much less likely than a Clinton victory, but I still think there's a possibility there, and I don't want people to be complacent.
Your views on it, sir?
Yeah, I mean, if I had to stick my neck out, I would say Hillary's going to win the election. Because the way the system works, you need a majority in the Electoral College. And it's quite often happened that the Republicans win a lot of the very small states with relatively few Electoral College votes. There's only one very big state they tend to win regularly, and that's Texas. Whereas two of the biggest states, California and New York, regularly vote for the Democrats. And then if you look at the other states, some of the relatively big numbers are in what's called the toss-up column, where it could go either way. Right now, the fact that Trump's remarks have so completely alienated Hispanic voters means that Florida is in play, which it really wasn't for many elections in the last 7 or 8. And even Arizona, which Republicans have won every one of the last 7, 8 elections, Hillary has now made a real push, including going with a vice presidential candidate who made an entire speech in fluent Spanish. So I think that, when you realize we're talking about 15% of the population in America being Hispanic, including my daughter-in-law, I might add, the fact is that this is an important appeal, this is an important segment. Then you've got undoubtedly the minorities. I'm told that the Indian Americans are about 70% for Hillary, 7% for Trump, and the rest are undecided. Now, why anyone is undecided so late, I have no idea. And they wonder what they're reading or not reading to get to the undecided state. But the fact is that right now, all the indications to me are that Trump will win a majority of the white working class and possibly slightly more than half of the rest of the white male vote. But I don't know if that alone is going to counterbalance the votes that he will lose amongst minorities, blacks, Hispanics, and so on, with the result that at the end of the day, and women, by the way, women will vote overwhelmingly for Hillary, and therefore I really think that at the end of the day, this should be no contest. This should be a straightforward win for Hillary. Now, of course, I might be wrong, but that's the way I would analyze it.
Well, the fact that it is a contest is I think, an indictment on Hillary's campaign, actually. It's her fortune that she's running against Trump, but she's also, in her own way, a bit of a flawed candidate. But I think more than who's going to win the election, what's been interesting to see in the last few months is what this election has revealed about the U.S. as a country and where its politics are going. You have now, in the US and in parts of Europe, this new force that Trump represents and other parties and political parties and tendencies in Europe represent, of a kind of authoritarianism, an identity politics based around white nationalism. That's a phrase that's being used quite a lot now, and that had not been discussed at all 4 years ago in the last election cycle. So what you're seeing is the reshaping of certain fundamental assumptions in American politics, and how that plays out in subsequent years, looking beyond the next few election cycles, is almost the greater meaning of this election than whether Clinton wins or Trump wins.
A dark era which got released yesterday, the era of darkness. Are we looking at something of those sorts in America? Is that kind of darkness or a shade of darkness associated with what is going to be the outcome of the elections?
I wouldn't say that there's an era of darkness ahead. I mean, if Trump wins, then potentially yes, but I don't think he'll win. But at the same time, there are serious problems in the US and in Western societies that the current political systems are not dealing with, and have to adjust to find better solutions for. Namely, that the processes of globalization that in many ways have helped countries like China and India have hollowed out the middle classes in the West, and how you created immense inequality. Now, there's also immense inequality in India, but just regarding the West, what you see in the Brexit vote, in Trump's rise, in the popularity of also left-wing parties and Bernie Sanders in the West, is this frustration at the evaporation of the middle class and of the sense that many people are losing access and losing touch to the way the economy is changing and growing. And so this is a question that is almost, you can't address it just on a national basis, but the politics are national. The political parties are trying to grapple with a global phenomenon. And so how we manage in national politics to deal with this global phenomenon in the West is fascinating and challenging, and I think something that's worthy of following.
Actually, I think Kanishk is right there, because, if you look around the world right now, you're seeing, and that's where the darkness comes in, you're seeing the rise of a lot of very negative forces, which, because of the factors he has described, the hollowing out of the middle class, the sense that globalization has disempowered a number of people. I mean, the whole thing about the American dream, that every American worker believed he would have a better life than his father, a bigger house, a bigger car, all of that, and suddenly it's no longer possible. All of this has created, and it's not just in America, it's across the Western world, a kind of very nasty backlash in which people are turning against the forces that are not within their control, that they can't understand, and that they see as threatening the kinds of dreams they always had. And the result, therefore, is the xenophobia, the anti-immigration, anti-refugee backlash, the racism, the divisive politics, the language of hatred, Trump saying he will ban every Muslim from coming to America, all of this kind of talk, plus the Brexit vote, which really was an anti-immigrant vote. Brexit was not so much about all the other economic arguments that were made, it was principally people didn't want to hear foreign voices around them on the street and in the pub and in the school anymore, or on the bus anymore. So you've got the Brexit vote, you've got the rise of Marine Le Pen in France. In the French system, a number of candidates run in the first round, and then the top two contest for the presidency. Everyone from France is telling me that it's almost certain that she will be one of the top two. That's a really alarming prospect because she's an extremist, rather racist, right-wing xenophobe. You look at the rise of similar parties in Hungary. There's a movement called Jobbik. You look at places like, well, Turkey. Perhaps some Turks might tell me I'm exaggerating it, but the truth is Mr. Erdogan is sort of a Turkish equivalent of this sort of ultra-right, religiously centered and culturally chauvinistic nationalism. So you have example after example in many parts of the world where such forces are rising. In many cases, they're sanctified by democracy because they've been able to build on the fears of people to win majority support in elections. But that doesn't necessarily make it a good thing. After all, you know, Hitler did win an election in 1933. I mean, then he didn't hold any elections after that, but the fact is he did win. When Mussolini first came to power in Italy, he was hailed. So are we returning to an era in which some of these dark forces will hold sway, will win popular support, will use some of modern technology, social media, television, and so on, in order to propagate hatred, fear, division? That is a real prospect. We were also benign about globalization. We thought it was such a wonderful thing and the whole world was going to be knitted together, one market, one village, one audience, you know, no borders, no connections. You can talk to people across half a world on email. You can transfer billions of dollars with a click of a cursor. You can fly across the world on a jet plane. Everyone thought the world is coming together. In fact, in many ways, there are forces that are trying to splinter the world apart. So that is the darkness we should be worrying about and I hope resisting.
Actually, it brings to my mind the words of Tagore, where the world is now being broken up into tiny fragments by narrow domestic walls. And I don't think we are seeing the rise of a one world concept other than where we have all nationals here, such a beautiful audience who have been so attentive, and they would be cursing in their hearts, saying that he's going on and on talking, he's not giving us a chance. So I think we have to open up for the audience. We can have questions from among you, and it's a moment where you have the questions and we would have the father and son answer for you.
Good evening, sir. My name is Nishad. I'm working as a management faculty over here. So my question is something related to current India. Sir, I think we are going to a dark age. News coming from different parts of India are really shocking. So, day before yesterday, the one-day ban for NDTV because of something related to the surgical strike over there, and slaughtering human beings in the name of eating beef, and what we can say, growing intolerance, especially against downtrodden and minorities. Actually, my doubt, even if Indians know very well BJP is led by Hindutva, I mean some extreme agenda, and is it because of the fault of Congress, the legacy which was left by Congress from the independence till 2000, BJP was getting a chance or not?
You know, in every democracy, people will want an alternative at some point. You know, understand that some people felt that there were reasons for frustration with Congress rule. I would only point to the legacy that they inherited in 1947 when the Congress came to power. The British had left behind a country, as I said earlier, that had been completely ruined and reduced to poverty. So when you have a country with 90% below the poverty line, and through your policies you bring it to 26%, you may say 26% is terrible, there's still 26% of people under the poverty line. But if you look at that, it was 90% 70 years ago, perhaps it's not so bad. Similarly, the life expectancy when the British left was just 27 years. Today it's 69. Literacy was 16%. Today it's 82. Female literacy was 8%. Only 8% of Indian women could read and write when the British left. Today it is 66%. And so on. You can see that to say the Congress has done nothing for 60 years is terribly unfair. A lot of Congress governments have accomplished a great deal, and indeed Congress is the party that created some of the infrastructure of this country and the party that liberalized the economic system in 1991 and helped initiate the last 25 years of high growth. Now, the Indian public, as in any democracy, is entitled to want to try an alternative. And as you know, they have tried many alternatives. In the middle of the 90s, we had the United Front governments. In fact, the late 80s, you had the VP Singh experiment. Then you had the United Front governments of Devagowda and Gujral. Then you had the BJP government of Vajpayee. Then again, Congress came back under Manmohan Singh, and now it's Narendra Modi's turn. In some ways, that suggests that the Indian voter is a demanding voter, and if he's not satisfied or she's not satisfied with what the government is doing, he or she will change them again, will throw them out and bring a new lot in. So I don't believe that anybody can be complacent. And I really do believe that these actions that you mentioned of the present ruling dispensation, whether it is interfering in people's kitchens and dining rooms and telling them that they can't eat this or they can eat that, whether it's interfering in people's bedrooms and telling them how they can make love and to whom, whether it's interfering in people's religious practices, whether it's interfering in people's free expression, as you said rightly. It's shocking that a major Hindi language channel, the NDTV India, has been shut down for 24 hours on the 9th in punishment for doing the kind of reporting that 25 other channels also did. There was no other difference, but they're singled out because they have been a very strong liberal critical voice of the government. All of these things are definitely negative, but these very negatives will, I believe, cost the ruling party votes in the next election.
It's an honor to be able to ask you this question. I must confess I'm asking it partially because I'm a senior teacher and it's part of a discussion we've just had, and partially because I'd like to know your answer. So my question is, and it leads well from the last one, what do you think is better, a weak democracy or a strong dictator?
For me, there is no doubt on the matter that democracy is a preferable system. Because the ultimate question I always ask myself is, what would you rather live under? If I would rather live under a system where I am free to think, free to speak, free to make my own choices, free to live the life I want to live, then how can I, in the name of some nebulous common good, wish to deny that choice to other people, as a dictatorship would? Because a strong dictatorship, as you say, may bring about general changes for a society, but in the process it will hurt a lot of people and it will obviously violate individual choice. As I've said about the growth of the Chinese economy, I've said they've grown at breakneck speed, but in the process they have broken quite a lot of necks. That is the real problem, that in our system, ultimately everyone is brought along with it. Change comes gradually. Change is often inefficient. There is a lot of corruption in the system. But at the end of the day, individuals have been able to pursue their own dreams and in many cases to remake their lives for the better. Whereas in a dictatorship, it's only what the dictatorship decrees you can do that you are allowed to do. And a lot of people live in fear. Which is not to suggest that there aren't other kinds of fears. I've often said that, you know, here in India we talk a lot about terrorism, but there is also for many of our people the daily terror of hunger, poverty, ill health. I'm not discounting that. But still, knowing that you have the freedom to pursue your own choices, your own options, your own efforts will get you an opportunity to do something different with your life. That is what I think characterizes a democracy. And therefore, for every individual human being, it's better to live in a democracy, however weak or inefficient it may be, than to live in a dictatorship where somebody else is making all the decisions for you. Do you agree, Kanishk?
I agree completely, and I know your question is coming more out of the Indian context, but I think it's worth noting that much of the rhetoric that Trump uses in the US is emphasizing the idea that the system as it exists is broken, and that the country needs a strong man, authoritarian figure to bully change into being. And I think it's that kind of rhetoric, the idea that you need a strong man, is not something that only Indians are thinking about. It's something that's actually flavored the politics of many countries. And I am from the position that we have to resist that idea.
Good evening, sir. My name is Shan, and I represent a radio station here called Club FM. And during my random researches, I used to see your videos. So I happened to see a video which is just like a forum like this earlier, where you made a point saying that by 2020, the world's largest workforce will be from India. Indians will make the largest workforce. Is it so? If then, is this what you mean by Make in India? If that is the point which you meant to make, then Make in India was a project or a design or a concept which was first mentioned by Shashi Tharoor. Should we believe like that?
No, I was only extrapolating from available information. For example, the International Labour Organization, the ILO of the UN, had actually given statistics to back up. I was quoting those. For example, they say that by 2020, India will have, in the job starting age group of 19 to 23, we will have something in the neighborhood of 113 million people, I believe it was, whereas China would only have 92 million. The numbers may no longer be exact because I read these numbers some time ago, but that was sort of the kind of difference. So clearly, if we are going to be the larger, more dynamic, productive, youthful workforce, we could indeed be the manufacturing engine for the world. But I also added, it depends on our ability to skill and train our young people, educate our young people, form them to be able to take advantage of the opportunities available to the world in the 21st century. And there I have to say, we may not have done as well. Secondly, there are some trends in global industry and global manufacturing that may yet make in India impossible. That is, for example, the extraordinary level of automation that is happening in many industries. The world may no longer require large numbers of lightly skilled or semi-skilled young people to run factories doing things because they may have robots doing them in future. That will suddenly cause a major challenge for us in India. We can say Make in India, but the employer may come and say Make in India with fewer people because we have robots now as part of our automated processes. Then there are all the other technological changes that are happening. For example, the ways in which we are now seeing serious experiments in the US with driverless cars. What happens in a country like the UAE or a country like in India? There must be 25 million people whose only profession is driving. If suddenly the world has cars that don't require to be driven, where do all these people go? What kind of jobs can we find them? What's their economic future? So there are major challenges. I don't want to necessarily beat the drums for Make in India, because Make in India may not actually be ultimately the answer for our challenges. Perhaps the more important answer would be Do in India. And that could be doing all sorts of things. Hospitality industry, tourism, services of various sorts, creative arts. Doing all those things might be, in the end, where we would actually find our strengths. If we can revive our old strengths in handicrafts, in arts and dance and music and culture hand-done sculptures and architecture and all of these things. Those might be our strengths, which used to be our strengths in the old days, while the industrial processes are more and more taken over by robots and automatons. What do you think, young man? You're going to live to see that world, I may not.
I do think the question of automation is an important one. And the model that, say, a country like China or Vietnam, or even to an extent greater than India, Bangladesh has used to lift people out of poverty based on low-skilled industrial work, may not be a tenable future. And you're seeing that again, that's also an issue in developed countries, where the existing industrial base is withering away because those jobs have left, and those jobs that are still there are being swiftly replaced by automation. The question is then, in the West, and I wonder if this is the kind of question you'd see in India, is if you're moving towards societies where certain kinds of work don't exist, do you try to orient societies away from the idea of work in the first place? And how do you arrange that? There are notions like universal basic income, which once were fringe ideas, the idea that that the government would give everybody a certain amount of money to live off every month. But that used to be a fringe idea that's now come into the mainstream in both a capitalist country like the US and a more social democratic country like Finland. So I think it's really interesting that the question of automation really poses these grand, larger questions about how we organize societies. And I don't have those answers. I don't think any of us do, but we have to be conscious of these.
I have a question about your book with Jinnah and the partition of India. M.J. Akbar, in his book, he talked about his book, Blood Brothers. He talked about how everyone before partition were brothers and sisters, and as soon as partition happened, there was a lack of trust. And I think that lack of trust is still going on in India. What can you do to restore that trust?
Well, I think there are two different kinds of lack of trust. There is a lack of trust between India and Pakistan, and I think you are referring also to a lack of trust between communities in India. Is that right? Have I got your question right? So between India and Pakistan, I'm afraid the lack of trust is based on actual experience and events, which obviously have frustrated would-be peacemakers on the Indian side. I can give you example after example of peace initiatives taken by Indian leaders that were met with betrayal from the other side. 1999, you have the agreement in Lahore, declarations of the spirit of Lahore. The Indian Prime Minister takes a bus across to Pakistan and concedes his fervent prior opposition to the raison d'etre of Pakistan in a historic speech. But within 3 months of talking of the spirit of Lahore, you have the Kargil infiltration by the Pakistanis trying to capture heights in the Indian side of Kashmir. You have peace talks in Agra, and then that's followed by an attack on the Indian Parliament. You have genuine attempt to make peace between India and Pakistan under President Zardari in Pakistan, and you then have the 26/11 terrorist attack on Mumbai, and so on and so forth. So there is a feeling that there are elements in Pakistan who are determined to attack India and to thwart any process of building trust and peace. And that, I'm afraid, therefore, has become extremely difficult. It's very difficult now for an Indian political leader to seriously advocate peacemaking with Pakistan, because the track record in the last 10, 15 years has been littered with the kinds of examples that I've given you. Having said that, my own view is that we can do something different. Don't bother to talk to the civilian government because they have no power. Don't bother to talk to the military because their entire reason for existence, their disproportionate command of such a large section of the Pakistani budget and the Pakistani GDP depends on their fomenting hostility with India. So you will never get genuine peace with them because their own survival and prosperity would be at stake. So the military will continue to support terrorism, militancy, Lashkar-e-Taiba, all of that. But I would say, do enhance people-to-people contact, open up generous policy with regard to visas for Pakistanis, encourage Pakistani movie stars to act in Indian movies, Pakistani artists and singers and fashion designers and whoever else to come to India and have access to the Indian market and the Indian audience, open up even business opportunities for Pakistani businesses, because in this process, I believe India's soft power will work to its advantage. We will create more goodwill for us in Pakistan than we have thoroughly been able to enjoy in recent years. And certainly, it'll be the opposite of the current method of just shutting down the doors to contact with normal Pakistanis. That could be a way of building trust between the peoples of the two countries. Now, within India, the story is very different. I mean, everybody is an Indian citizen. Everybody has the equal rights and equal stake in the future of India. And therefore, if there is mistrust, it's because of extremists on both sides who have said irresponsible things. And I think it's the duty of all of us who believe in coexistence, in acceptance of each other, and in living together and cooperating together to work strongly for harmony and cooperation. And let me assure you, young lady, that from my experience of India, and I've only returned to living full-time in India in the last 9 years, in fact, really more like 8 years, I can say truthfully that there are far more people who believe in the coexistence and cooperation of different religious communities in India than those who would rather divide them and promote mistrust. So I think on this one, the good guys are winning.
Good evening, Akikuan. Is it not really important to have a responsible media who portrays it rightly than have a free media who is easily capitalizing on the insecurities of the people rather than the right details? What's your opinion about it? I would rather say it's on an Indian perspective or on a world perspective.
Well, I mean, I've been unfortunately victimized myself by some of the more irresponsible elements in the Indian media, so I have a great deal of sympathy for the thrust of your question. We have now seen a development of a certain kind of sensationalistic journalism in India based on voyeurism, based on the obsession with what the television media calls TRPs or rating points, with the result that every few seconds there is something called breaking news in which data, details, sentences, expressions are twisted out of context in order to create a sensation. This is the kind of journalism that's being practiced. Inevitably, the print media is also following suit because they know that they are selling their newspapers in the morning to people who have been watching television the previous evening. Therefore, they also have to mirror some of the same stories and some of the same sensationalism. It really has been very, very worrying. We've seen, in particular, some genuinely irresponsible reporting that has harmed the nation on national security issues, on the kind of jingoism we've seen that have been pushing the government towards warfare and military action, which may certainly not be in the interests of the people of India. We have seen on criminal matters, the media appointing itself judge, jury, prosecution, executioner, everything, without allowing people the right to a fair hearing in the judicial process and in the investigative process. All of this has been very, very worrying. And I believe very passionately in freedom of the press. I do believe that a responsible media is essential in a democratic society to actually throw a critical light and in a constructive way upon the workings of those in power, those in government, and so on. But an irresponsible press does more damage not only to the society it seeks to alter through its reporting, but to itself, because credibility is the most precious asset that journalism can have. When I wrote in India Shastra in one of the essays, how a friend of mine used to say that, he said that my father used to say that unless something is printed in the Times of India, I don't believe it. Today he says, if something is printed in the Times of India, I don't believe it. That's what has happened to the credibility of the press in India today. And I think it's a great loss for the media as well as for Indian society. You want to say something about the rest of the world?
Well, the questioner didn't ask about the world context. But I think it's interesting to note that the Indian term coined in social media of prostitutes to describe media people is now also being used in the US by Trump supporters to attack media there.
Good evening, sir. My name is Swapna David, and to be able to speak to a person who I have looked with so much awe, I consider it as a great privilege.
Thank
Now,
you.
my question is, so you've said India is no longer a developing country, but a developed country in a state of advanced decay. Is that one of the reasons for you to enter the politics? Because do you believe that to make any change in the Indian scenario, to enter the politics is necessary? Now, my second part to this is, in one of your books, you've said that there is nothing called a wrong place or a wrong time. Where you are is where you're meant to be. But have you ever felt that you entering the politics was a wrong time or a wrong place?
Thank you for those two tough questions. On the first one, yes. I mean, I came into politics because I genuinely believe in trying to make a difference. I think we're all on this planet for a purpose. That purpose is to leave the planet a slightly better place for us having been there. We may do good just for our families or our neighborhoods or our villages or our own immediate work environment, but each of us, through what we do, we make a difference to the lives of people around us. And because I'd had the privilege of working at the United Nations, affecting for better, I'm pleased to say, the lives of large numbers of refugees, working in peacekeeping, working at the top echelons of an organization that was trying to bring about meaningful progress and development in the world, I'd always had that search for meaning embedded in every day of my existence. So when I left the UN, I found that while I was leading a very comfortable life, doing some consultancies for private companies, including one based in Dubai, I honestly didn't feel the same satisfaction that I would have felt if I knew the things I'd done during the day had helped people, had changed people, had affected people for the better in some way or the other. So when the opportunity came to enter Indian politics, I didn't hesitate for a second, because I thought precisely, as you said, that in a democracy, there is no better way to actually play a meaningful role in guiding the destiny of your people and your nation than through politics. And of course, I have had some very, very unpleasant experiences in the process. I've had lots of ups and downs. Some may say more downs than ups. The Agni Pariksha that I was put through, particularly in the initial year or so of my entry into politics, was quite something, because I ended up with my back perforated by the stilettos that were pushed into it by various people, including some in my own party. But you know, all of this is the price one pays for trying to make a difference in public service. And I'm determined I will try to do so. Even in opposition, I have been using my role in opposition to try and do a lot of things that I could not when I was in government. For example, in trying to push the boundaries of our freedoms in many ways in India by, for example, introducing bills that would expand, that would declassify public records, that would amend the definition of sedition, that would decriminalize sexual behavior between consenting adults and private, all sorts of things which I have done with a view, and which would introduce a refugee and asylum law, which would improve the working conditions of domestic workers. All of these things are attempts to try and expand the space for constitutional freedom in our society. And I hope that at the end people will recognize that I was trying to do all this not for any personal gain, but ultimately to try and make India a better place. Now from there, I come to your second question about whether I might be the wrong man in the wrong place in the wrong country. Look, I do believe that the sentence, by the way, that you're quoting is from my novel Riot, where a character says there is no such thing as the wrong place at the wrong time. We are where we are at the only time we have. Perhaps that's where we're meant to be. I am rather proud of that line, because I think ultimately when you look about it, we are where we are. Whatever circumstances have brought us here, we are where we are. And this is the time that we have. This is our time. Therefore, in that sense, it's better to see it as being where we're meant to be. Despite all the negatives, I don't regret having made the move to India. In fact, I have actually been headhunted by a few international organizations after coming back to India, and I've declined them all, and even declined to go for an interview or a discussion about a position. I said, I've made my choice. I've been there, done that, as the American teenagers like to say. I've done the rest of the world, and now the time has come for me to try and make a real contribution at home. So it's quite possible that at the end of my innings, people look back and say, well, he really wasted his time here, it didn't make any of a difference. But, you know, you have to try. And ultimately, that is the lesson the Bhagavad Gita teaches all of us, which is that the duty must be done irrespective of the result. That the effort is worth making whether or not you succeed in bringing about the change and the results you want to see. So I'm proud of the fact that I have been able to, in my own small way, try and make that effort.
And words of gratitude, if I keep searching, probably it'll take me a long time to fill up a line for you, because I'll be searching for the right word, because admiration, adoration, and all the positive words have to be filled in that particular line of gratitude.
Thank you.
And I'm sure those who walked in an hour ago are walking out with loads of knowledge and a bit more enlightened and much more happier, seeing a historical moment in the making. We thank you very much, sir.
Thank you,
Thank
Krish.
you.
Thank you all very much. It's been a terrific audience.
We'll have the book signing. Those who have the books, we'll have it in the lounge. So the majlis, which you see behind, so you can be there with your book to get the book signed. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. It was a pleasure hosting two great authors, the father and son. Moving on, we have one more book being launched, which is the Malayalam version of the India Shastra book. The book which was launched yesterday by the Vice President. An Era of Darkness is being launched now. A big round of applause, please. As we had told you earlier, this particular book was launched by the Vice President of India yesterday, and today on Sharjah International Book Fair we get to see the book launched internationally.